Hey, hello, hi. Today we're going to be talking about Suffer and Be Still, which is a book that's really more like an anthology of multiple essays, specifically surrounding the station of Victorian women. Today is going to be a little bit different. I do have a script, but I'm going to be mostly going off script. I've had kind of a doozy of a week, and this one's just going to be a little more informal, I guess. Which also means that it might be a little bit messy. I might get a little rambly.
Sometimes I'll start a sentence, and I don't even know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way.
But it's probably just going to be kind of short and sweet. So, buckle in. All right, so like I said, Suffer and Be Still is an anthology of 10 essays. I sometimes refer to them as essays or chapters because each essay has its own dedicated chapter. It was edited by Martha Vicinis, who was an editor of an existing publication at the time in 1972, specifically about Victorian. So one of the things that I really liked about this book is the fact that each essay sort of acts as like a foundational piece for the next essay or a few essays later. So like, for example, the governess's station in Victorian governess is discussed in depth, and then it gets referenced essentially in the fourth essay, which is about marriage, redundancy, or sin, the painter's view on women. So art history essentially for that one. There's like excerpts of plays or operas in the second essay, which is called From Dame to Woman, and it focuses on like the declining prevalence of the dame character in theatrical works. And then it gets quoted, that same play gets quoted in a later essay, The Painter's View. So again, another sort of art historian one. There are essays on prostitution and how the working class woman may have turned to that like illicit employment due to financial woes, which is discussed sometimes academically, but not a whole lot, so it was an interesting read as well. So the introduction, written by the editor Martha Vicinis, she says, quote, "Much of the material currently being published covers the familiar ground of the rise of feminism and emancipation or male attitudes towards women," end quote. And that sort of set up me, at least as a reader, to think that this is going to be a more women-voiced study. And there are lots of essays in here that are written by women. However, a lot of the sources that are utilized by these women are unfortunately contemporary men. And it does get a little bit overbearing after a while. Like, you get told that this is going to be different and it's not going to be the men's view. And then it like ends up absolutely being the men's view. And that's just kind of lame. Like, there's nothing wrong with it. Of course, it makes sense that the majority of contemporary works are going to be written and researched by men. It is Victorian England after all, but I was hoping for a little more. So the very first essay, Working Class Women in Britain, covers basically the plight of both the employed woman as well as the homemaker. This one is written by a man, but it was pretty refreshing because he specifically acknowledges that most of the study of this like period of this subject is very much dominated by the male voice. He did actively seek out contemporary writings of women, and he was able to find a particularly interesting one that he quotes pretty heavily by Lady Florence Bell. And like, yes, there is going to be a class separation, you know, like genteel versus the working and impoverished class, but there is still sympathy and clarity that is really only available whenever it's offered by a person who is the same sex as the observed when it comes specifically to sex-specific study. Does that make sense? So it was a woman's voice talking about women. This is like particularly important in this era, as the separation of sexes in general just kind of transcended the class of British society. Like, women had their place and men had their place, and that was just how it was, you know? The next chapter talks about, again, the separation of the sexes and rights, and it's called The Debate Over Women, Rusk versus Mill. And this is basically just a debate, an argument about the place of womankind. The two sides are that women are by nature needing to be subjugated and sheltered versus that being like purely because of societal pressures. And like, I think we all know where we stand on that one now. Well, majority where I stand anyway on that one now. But it was interesting to read. The next chapter, Stereotypes of Femininity and a Theory of Sexual Evolution, tackles that exact same problem of like nature versus nurture, except for it's taking it from soft sciences to hard sciences. But unfortunately, the contemporary works utilized in this research creates, it was a confirmation bias, essentially, is what happened in that contemporary work. And so that is what gets presented in the essay. And that was a little disappointing, but like, what was I expecting, really?
I don't know what I expected.
So as we all know, female sexuality is of dire concern to the Victorian person, and so some time is spent discussing sexuality, both repressed and learned. And that discussion was, and still is, very warranted. Having already discussed at this point the like plight of the harlot, the social struggles of the working woman, and like general discourse which surrounds like why a woman is conditioned to subjugation, the discussion of female sexuality in the context of contemporary expectation of behavior had sort of been like skirted in previous essays, outside of like insanity, because like why else would a woman want sex, right?
Ugh, brother, ugh.
Or necessity, like for money, like prostitution. There's this like overt asserted belief that women don't require and they don't desire in any way intimacy or pleasure. The penultimate essay, Innocent Feminist Sensualis in Unconscious Conflict, say that 10 times fast, sets out to examine those like contributing factors regarding the female conditioning and like how their education led the Victorian person to believe this whole concept that women don't need sex outside of purely for procreation or for money or something. It wasn't like an internal desire. Believe that was right and natural. So the very last essay is honestly a little bit jarring. It's essentially a annotated bibliography of, I shit you not, 500 books. It's cool. It's really helpful for like a budding historian or even for like an existing historian who just wants to know a little bit more about this particular subject of study. It's like a launching point, you know? But it was such a 180 from this like, I'm going to tell you about this subject to like a straight up list of a bunch of books. Like I just wasn't prepared for it. I don't know why. And it kind of reminds me of those like further reading and guided questions that you find at the end of like chapter books. Like, why do you think Junie B. Jones lied to her mom? Was it because, like, you know, you know what I'm saying, right? So something that I particularly like about this book, Suffer and Be Still, is that it's looking at a singular point of study, so women in the Victorian era, but it's doing it from multiple angles, like different avenues of study. It covers sociology, biology, evolutionary science, socioeconomic anthropology, which was like one of my favorite subjects in college, art history, psychology, and like obviously the individual historian's like own drawn conclusions on this subject. And that is just, it's interesting. It's a good varied approach to the subject. Women's studies, women's history is itself, like by nature, just a very broad and complex and nuanced subject. But what this book does is creates a sort of like tight launching point by going from these really 9 essays and 1 annotated bibliography to like start your own historical research journey. I think it provides a really interesting perspective, especially when you take into account that it was published in 1972. And that was really when like women's studies in general was really in its infancy. So some of these conclusions that are drawn in these essays are sort of common knowledge now, but at the time they were very likely pretty groundbreaking, or at the very least like exceptionally thought-provoking, because this subject in general just really hadn't been fleshed out, and even now it's still not that terribly fleshed out, but it's growing. But yeah, like all in all, Suffer and Be Still is a pretty straightforward read. It's relatively accessible. It's essentially like reading a academic anthology or like one of those publications, those academic journals, from cover to cover, because it's sort of what it was. Originally, it was many of these essays were published in a special edition. Martha Vicinis was an editor of a particular academic journal. And so a handful of the essays actually came from a special edition about Victorian women, I think. It might have been either Victorian women or Victorian England. That was published in 1970. And then because it was so popular, she went and solicited more essays, essentially, from other historians, and then created this compilation to then publish in this 1972 book. You can read the first 26 pages for free on Google. I don't remember it being particularly expensive. Let me know if you like this video. If you have read the book before, or if you're considering reading it, or if you read it after watching this video, please come back and talk about it in the comments. I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next one. Bye! ASMR break. That wasn't very satisfying. The taste was satisfying, but the crunch was not.